So yesterday I got to talk to somebody who I've been stoked to interview for like a month. Matthew Dawkins, the creative strategist for Onyx Path, the creator of the They Came From series, and writer and designer for several other RPGs. We talked about the ethical duties of the writer. We talked about stories as design problems. We asked, is it possible to make a story or an RPG which Nazis can't appropriate? That kind of thing. I've linked to his website below where you can find a list of books he's worked on and maybe buy a few. He's also got a Patreon where you can hire him to be a GM, and he is a gifted GM. So if that interests you at all, go for it. One disclaimer before we go, I don't do hot takes. If I can't cite you the chapter and verse on whatever it is I'm saying, and if it's a very important subject, I don't include it in the video. So in a couple of places, Matthew and I talk about politics, and I cut it because he's very knowledgeable. He can cite you where he got the information he's talking about. I can't. So there's some legitimately fascinating conversation on the cutting room floor. I hope he and I get a chance to talk about it again. I just can't share it with you. Ditto if the conversation just got a little too personal on my end. Apologies. But other than that, this is the conversation we had, and I had so much fun. So, yeah, I hope you guys enjoy as much as I did. I am here with Matthew Dawkins, who is the creative director and in-house developer for Onyx Path, which publishes tabletop RPGs. He's also a freelance writer, and just for the people watching, I checked his credits on DriveThruRPG just before doing this. You have 101 writing credits there.
Good Lord.
Yeah, since 2014, which is prolific. Like, that's crazy.
Yeah. Well, there's something to be said there about work-life balance and not having it. Now, I'm going to issue a correction immediately, because I'm not the creative director. That is a fine man by the name of Richard Thomas. I'm the creative strategist. Big difference.
Creative strategist. I'm so... Okay, creative strategist.
It's all right. Easy mistake. But, no, it's a pretty tight team at Onyx Path. We often overlap in the things that we do, but yeah, I oversee the development of numerous books, numerous game lines, and I write for numerous games as well, some for Onyx Path, some for other companies as well. You know, the life of the freelancer, you kind of get work where you can.
Yep. Let's see, you have, I think your most notable work within the RPGs is probably Beckett's Jihad Diary. Would you say that?
Well, I think it's definitely possible. It's the book I
also
refer
they
to.
came from series. Sorry.
Yeah. No apology needed, I promise. Beckett's Jihad Diary is... I often describe it as the book I think I will probably be remembered for, if I am remembered for anything. Or maybe the book that I was most meant to write, and co-write, co-develop. It's not a solo project. Very few of our games are. They came from the series of They Came From games, Beneath the Sea, Beyond the Grave, etc., etc. They were my concepts put into, formed into fully formed games. Ultimately, once they were written, the art was created, they were laid out, sold, and so on, which is a very different proposition to something like Beckett's or Vampire the Masquerade in general, because, of course, those are now purely Onyx Path properties that they came from, whereas Vampire and the other World of Darkness games are licensed. So the freedom you have to create on something that is, of course, largely your own, and when I say largely your own, I mean Onyx Path, is far greater than when working to a licensor who will have certain ideas in mind in terms of direction, whether it's restrictions, whether it is specific directions for what you need to include, whether it is suddenly instructing you to cut this because it conflicts with something you're unaware of as a licensee. There's lots of balls you have to keep juggling with licensed properties, but it's a fun challenge. I like working on in both sort of lanes. But yeah, as you know, and to anyone who watches this and listens to this, I don't provide short answers. Never do.
I did ask for a little more time because I went, oh no, I'll have to hurry this guy. But
I've got great admiration for the great polemicists of the 20th century. I wouldn't by any means consider myself one. But there are people, whether I agree with them politically or not, or morally in some cases, the individuals like Christopher Hitchens, like Leon Trotsky, there's all kinds of fantastic speakers and writers who can really be very colourful, but often they need a bit of time to do it. And I think I've tried to, or inadvertently or intentionally, try to follow in their vein rather than just delivering punchy sentences and moving on to the next point.
I mean, I really admire the fact that you've worked on that. I know you, I had speech issues growing up, and I know you, yeah. But I really admire that you worked on it.
Yeah, when I was, it wasn't just when I was younger, but certainly when I was at school, when I was in my late teens, all the way through to my early 20s, really, I wasn't a confident speaker. I was routinely mocked at school, bullied, whenever I spoke up. I had a voice that didn't sound like anybody else's, and so obviously difference results in you being bullied. And this continued into employment. It wasn't fun. And the main thing that turned me around, I suppose, or allowed me to control my narrative, as it were, was role-playing. YouTube videos, because YouTube videos are very much like rehearsing to a mirror, and you slowly speed up, as you get more confident in what you're saying. And watching, YouTube in general, as a platform, being able to find these fantastic videos, which I had never had access to before, of the great speakers of the world. Didn't really matter what the subject was, I would listen. I'd watch things like, even things as simple as gesticulations like I'm doing now, and I would just be absorbing it all sort of by osmosis, and steadily I became more and more confident in what I was saying, to the point that I never or really. Yeah, now people will be listening to that, listening for ums and ers. I barely blink, to be honest.
Yeah, I've definitely, if you look at my early YouTube videos, I don't move. I don't talk. So it's definitely been helpful for me. So how about I ask you a question?
Oh, go for it.
Okay. So what you do is primarily IP work and storytelling, which are primarily collaborative ways of telling stories. And then you do IP work, so the final product is not something you personally own.
That's correct.
So do you think that changes how you see stories? Especially since you do design work as well. So you design stories in a way, which is, I don't think most people think of stories as a designed thing.
No, I think that's a very good question, very good point, because I have created so little for myself, and I don't say that to sound altruistic or anything, as in I won't write for pleasure, It's a little like, I guess, if I want to be a bit metaphorical, I doubt there are many carpenters that spend their time crafting furniture for themselves. They craft it to sell. And once it's in someone else's hands, it's not theirs anymore. And so it's interesting. I think there was a time when I was younger, and I would guess I guess in the fan fiction mode, where I'd write stories for myself or for friends, or role play and text-based forums, things like that. That was more myself speaking, when you're working for a company, whether it's a friendly company where you know everyone, or whether it's a sort of blank slate or blank faces corporate company and you're writing for them, you do have to, in my view, I lose a little bit of personality when I do so. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because when you're creating a collaborative project, something I often harp on about with the They Came From games as an example, is you have to find a consistent tone across a book that has multiple authors. If every single author has a really vivid, this is my voice and this is how I sound, it seems discordant. You read through it and some people may love it because it will feel like an anthology. Some people will find it jarring and they won't be able to immerse themselves in it. And it tends to be the latter over the former. So it would be unfair to say that I think people writers dumb down work or tone down, but I would imagine myself and a lot of my peers are very conscious of the fact that you do have to write to someone else's template, because you are ultimately beholden to a contract someone else has given you. I haven't experimented yet. There is a game I have in mind one day, and it was unfortunately poorly timed, because I was going to start working on it earlier this year, that I was going to create for myself, get self-published, hire the artist, and that would have been my first foray into some kind of solo-produced written work, just to see how it went. Unfortunately, the subject matter would have clashed rather terribly with the war in Ukraine right now, because the subject I wanted to explore something some of my ancestors went through, which was the Holodomor in Ukraine. I'm a big...
I'm so sorry.
Well, I appreciate it. Unfortunately, much of the Jewish side of my family were pretty much all annihilated during that first half of the 20th century in various places across Europe. It was a bad time, I think, if I want to risk understatement. And I've long had a deep interest in Soviet history, and so all of this was kind of amalgamating into this idea I wanted to write a game which was going to be deep and thoughtful, where you're playing people in a village that was subject to forced collectivization and all of the dreadful things that came with it. Now, there was a lot of support, there was a lot of interest in it, but what followed was Russia invaded. Now, you could have said, that would be really timely. It would be a really good idea to highlight, but you could also be accused of trivializing, taking advantage of a tragedy that's going on right now, to say, here's my Ukraine game. So, yeah, I'm sitting on that for a while, but the idea is there.
Can I recommend you a video game?
Is it This War of Mine?
No, but it's similar.
Oh.
It feels similar to me. But I would have said This War of Mine is obvious, but this is less obvious. Pathologic 2, which is my favorite game of all time.
Okay.
Written by a Russian and Ukrainian team.
Mm.
In Russian, it's called Utopia. And it's set sort of in the late 19th century, early 20th century, sort of just post-industrial Russian steppe sort of place. And it's fully a fantasy, but it sort of digs into, it's a Russian-Ukrainian game called Utopia.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you might... And the studio has like fully released a statement saying that what's going on in Ukraine, like fuck Putin. So they're good people. Anyway,
no, that's a healthy stance to take. I would say, I don't mind getting political. To full-blown communism.
You know your shit.
And
yeah. There's we are completely off topic.
well, that's all right. We can go
fine.
long. We can go longer than an hour, and if you want to cut this out, that's absolutely fine.
Yeah. No, yeah. It's the thing about communists is we fight.
Yeah, very far off topic. But
Yes,
maybe that's a video. Maybe that's an interview for another day. Maybe.
Yeah, I apologize for going. I was definitely interested on your thoughts just as a person, so I just let it happen. I apologize. So,
if we run considerably late, that's fine. I've got nothing else going on tonight.
Okay. Let's see. How about I ask you a question? Do you see the books you write as a design problem in want of a story and setting, or do you set the mood, setting the story hooks, and then see what the system needs to be?
Well, never mind that. Let me talk about That's a good question. It differs, honestly. It depends on the game. I think for the most part I will see a story that needs a system that works for it. So I have an idea for a game in mind, but the game tends to be a concept rather than I want something that's going to support this system that involves D10s, D12s and D20s, or perfectly replicates long division through a nice handy table. And I know that sounds like I'm oversimplifying it, but there are people who are very much driven by the idea of system. I'm not necessarily one of them. I feel like the system should serve the game rather than the other way round. I do feel the opposite when it comes to miniatures games and some board games, that often the setting is set dressing. What you're really doing is playing an intricate mathematical equation and rolling through various permutations to see what the outcome can be. If you dress it up in an interesting way, that can make for a very fun game. But for role-playing games, that doesn't tend, in my experience, to be the case. Now, one of the best game designers I know, someone called Rose Bailey, is just about the queen of marrying system and setting. She has this perfect way of making every element of a system feel like it's part of the story. So we can look at games like games I've worked on, like They Came From Beneath the Sea or Beyond the Grave, or any of the other They Came Froms, where things like quips and cinematics and other cinematic powers make you feel like you're in a movie. That's doing the job, but you can still, I would say, see the lines. You can still see the dice getting rolled. You still know there's math behind it. All the way through to the other side of the spectrum, if you look at something, and I love a system like GURPS, the generic universal role-playing system, but it's a system that is universal. It's the same system for every single GURPS game. If you're playing sci-fi, horror, modern drama, historical, whatever the case may be, it's always the same system. And so what you're actually doing is telling a story and occasionally stopping to roll dice. There will be some game masters who can do it in an elegant way, but you will always see the seams in that. Now, what Rose can do, and other game designers, but Rose is one I'd like to call out, is she makes the system almost disappear within the gameplay, so that when you have to stop to roll dice, or maybe you don't even stop to roll dice, you just do it, it feels like an organic part of play. And I think it's a good watermark to aim for, and I wouldn't describe myself as being there. But certainly from what that means is when I design games, setting, flavour comes first. System then gets molded to fit, if I can, rather than designing them at the same time or designing the system and then attaching a setting to it, if that makes sense.
That does make a lot of sense. Let's see. So I think a lot of people assume that if a designer is a good person with good intentions, that whatever they're going to make isn't going to be useful to bad people. Like, you know, this tool that you make is going to fit uneasily in the hands of Nazis or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's the job of a writer? Like, I'm asking this because I don't know. Do you think it's the job of a writer to make what they make unfriendly to the worst people on Earth, or are you going to inevitably make sort of neutral tools?
I think it's very tricky to make a system punish people for playing in a wrong-headed way. And when I say wrong-headed, let's take Nazis as an example, because they're a very good one to use. So there are various, I know you are running some Vampire the Masquerade, you'll know that game has a fair amount of text that specifically addresses, if you're a fascist and you're reading this, fuck off and play something else. Sorry if this is, this needs ad revenue.
All you want.
Okay.
You can, and they don't demonetize for swearing anymore, we're good.
Oh, good. Oh, good. But... you know, Vampire says that, lots of games say that now, and there will always be a portion of the audience that really riles up, and it's not necessarily the Nazis. I mean, most Nazis don't see themselves as Nazis, problematically. It'd be so much easier if they did, if they accepted what they were and then sought help for it. Most of the time, it's people get affronted by disclaimers like that, or mechanics like the X card, check-in tools, session 0, speaking to your players about what kind of horrific content is going to be in a game, that sort of thing. Because, and it's a difficult thing to understand really, they identify on some level with the disclaimer that's being sent out, some of the problems that are being called out. It's not necessarily that they are a Holocaust-denying Nazi. It may well be that they have ran a game before that involved sexual violence, and they thought, this was great, everyone was horrified. I can attest that in my youth, I ran a game where the sort of shocker near the end of it was that the serial killer wasn't just killing his victims, he was doing something sexually horrible to them. Now, I had told the players beforehand this, and even when I was young, I was at least somewhat responsible, but not always. I'd done stupid things too, I admit. But I did say, there'll be an element of sexual violence. There'll be referenced, it won't be seen. And it was 3 hours later that they actually came upon it, so they'd forgotten this by that time. And were I to do it again, I probably would have called it out closer to that happening, or made there be more clues or something like that. But there are some people who will do that, and they won't have the wherewithal to necessarily reflect on this having possibly been a problem. And so they'll read a disclaimer and they'll think, you're talking down to me, you're treating me like I'm a child, why are you inserting all this woke politics into our games, etc., and so forth. And it's tiring to read that kind of criticism, but it's necessary that we put these disclaimers in, because we want to advertise this book, these games, as safe places for people who don't want to experience that kind of thing. And the good news is, if you do want to experience it, ignore the page. Or you've been playing with this group of players for the last 30 years, you've never changed your game, now you're about to. It's unlikely you're going to phase them all of a sudden if you've been throwing all kinds of horrific material at them before. But in terms of system, I mean, my mind's going to a very simple place, but if I were to, let's say, penalise someone for doing something horrific, or something evil, it could work. Let's take a paladin in D&D, for instance. It used to be that if you did committed enough sin as a paladin, you would lose access to your spells, or you'd lose access to your divine abilities, as it was a punishment, essentially. It was telling you, you've done wrong as a paladin. Now, that's addressing the issue as a character rather than as a player. And some people will attach the two and say, well, it's the player's decision to be an arse. It's not the character's. Whereas other people will quite confidently state, well, it was in character to burn down that village of goblins at the time, because there was a town of vulnerable humans just over the hill, and I know which lives I value more. So you can embed it, but it's a bit haphazard to do it like that. It's not nuanced. It's not nuanced to put a disclaimer in the front of a book either, quite frankly. But I think it is better to just outright address the players and say, you can do whatever you want with this game. It's your game. You've bought it. However, we don't condone it. We urge you to check with your players in advance if you intend to do something horrific, and just make sure everyone's having a fun time. It's something that gets lost, I think, very easily, especially when we start looking at things through a very political lens. I mean, everything is political, but it's easy to lose sight of fun and entertainment. And most of us come to the gaming table to play a game, to have fun. We're not coming with the idea of exorcising this particular demon, as an example. There are games that are, but most aren't. And so when we're told this game might contain horror related to childbirth, I think it's a decent thing to say to players that this game might contain that, because if a player is coming along to have fun, maybe their idea of fun doesn't involve horror related to childbirth. I use it as an example because it's probably the only trigger warning X card, line or veil that I put in games. It's something I just don't like due to trauma in my own life. I don't. It's quite all right. But I will say to a GM, if they're mindful enough to ask, is there anything you don't want us to cover? I'll say I don't want that. And every single GM I've ever said that to has respected my wish. I doubt that their game was going to contain it anyway, but it's certainly no skin off my nose to ask, and it shouldn't be any great agony for them to not include it. So, yeah, my preference is to handle it outside of the game mechanics rather than punishing players for doing something, unless the world itself is some kind of divinely mandated, this is what's moral and this isn't. But I don't know that that's the kind of game I'd be writing. Or running.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I personally write some horror, like that's sort of the mode I go to when I write fiction. Like even when I write literary fiction, it starts as a horror story and then I have to pull back. Mm-hmm. I think, we write about things that are like fate's worse than death and what's monstrous and all that kind of stuff. And I've noticed, like, even in your series, they came from "they" is a monster, which was interesting to me. Why is it important to you, as somebody who I think also kind of goes to horror as their first place? Why is it important to you to portray the monstrous?
That is something. I mean, I'm going to be very spontaneous here, because I don't know why I gravitate so easily to horror. it also readily to horror, I guess would be a better word, because it is my natural environment. I am most comfortable writing books for the world of darkness, or the actually horrific parts of games like They Came From Beyond the Grave or They Came From Camp Murder Lake. They have humour in as well. And I would say those are my two default modes, horror and humour. Why I consider it easier, or I guess more natural and appealing to tell the story of the monsters, is, I imagine, born from a long abiding interest in mythological stories. The first fantasy stories I was ever told were Greek myths. I wasn't receiving a classical education or anything like that. My grandmother had a large Reader's Digest book full of short stories, and there was stories like Narcissus and Perseus and Theseus and so on. And I remember my dad came back from a long work road trip once with a big sort of illustrated Odyssey, which I still have. And so I was more drawn to tales that involved monsters. But the one thing I was found lacking was that these monsters in these Greek myths were almost always killed, and they were very rarely drawn with any depth. Sometimes they were. It was usually a human that was cursed to become a monster. But quite often they were just awful creatures that needed slaying in the traditional mould. And so I remember I would get toys like monsters in my pockets. These predated Pokemon, and goblins, and if I was getting He-Man figures, I would be getting Skeletor's side before I'd be getting He-Man's side, because I found monsters more interesting. They were more colourful, their characters were more interesting to me. Their very appearance told a story. The story was so easy to tell. This person is cursed to look different, to act different, to have appetites that are different. And so when I finally started getting into horror movies, I was interested in movies with interesting, horrific antagonists. American Werewolf in London, pretty much all of the Hammer horror Draculas at some point. The idea of Dracula at all being a tragic figure, it was really born from Christopher Lee's portrayal. As much as it is hammy and it is silly at times, it's that era that creates what became Interview with a Vampire ultimately, and the vampire as a tragic figure. And then that moved into games with Vampire the Masquerade and the rest of the World of Darkness. The idea of portraying the bad guy with a sense of humanity, maybe honour, maybe some hidden shame. I mean, it's Beauty and the Beast territory, but it's a tale as old as time, but it gripped me far more than just strong man with sword goes, kills monster. That person, I couldn't give a toss about him. But the monster, that was interesting.
I've got my copy of the Odyssey like somewhere around here, because and I had an illustrated book of Greek myths and one of Norse myths, and it's so important to me, to the point where every time somebody has a baby, I'm like, here are your 2 books. Here are your gifts. I'm gonna make your kid like me. It's interesting. But definitely so I've run into sort of moralistic, why are you into this sort of thing? People are like, look, when you portray things, this is sort of the left's conversation on this, you create a desire for the thing portrayed.
Yeah.
And I'm like, sure, okay. And they're like, so Wuthering Heights. I'm like, you can take fucking Wuthering Heights from me, from my cold fucking dead hands. Absolutely not. or like, and I can't even imagine what they would do with Hellraiser, which they can also take from my cold goddamn dead hands. Like, no, these are mine. And
I got to see Hellraiser in the cinema earlier this year, which was a treat.
It's, you know, it's not the best made movie in some ways. Like the fact that it's in America somewhere. It's very funny as an American.
I think it's supposed to be. So it's for a brief Hellraiser tangent. I love Hellraiser. I love the first two Hellraisers. I'm not an idiot. The first Hellraiser is very strange in terms of setting.
It's very
because
strange.
The family move to London.
Right.
That's what happens at the beginning, if I recall, because of, for whatever reason, they're moving to London, they move into this new house. The Ashley Lawrence's character, I think that's her name, Kirsty, is it? I may be getting confused with Nightmare on Elm Street, but she's walking past a lot of notable London Thames side landmarks, and all of that's going on, and all of the people that the sort of evil seductress picks up are middle class British office sort of accountants and the like. Now, at the end of the first movie, as I recall it, you have and I have completely forgotten this until I saw it in the cinema recently, the "What is your pleasure, sir?" Turns into a flying gargoyle-like thing and flies off with the Layman configuration box. I had completely forgotten that happened. And I can't remember whether it must be the end of the first movie, where the removal people are taking the mattress out, and they've got really strong Brooklyn Bronx-ish accents, and one of them gets sucked into the big pile of blood, and Julia starts climbing up, and you're thinking, okay, so where actually is this? Because these people are clearly from New York.
Yeah.
And it's obviously a symptom of the budget.
Yeah.
A New York cop gets seen as well. It's a very muddled picture, very low budget, and yet it has a purity to it. It is like an exploitation movie. There's a giallo quality to it because of the sex that is so pervasive throughout the movie, and I think it's also a movie that, I'm not saying it's flawless by any means, but I think it's a movie that, as you get older, whether you're into sort of your fetish stuff and BDSM or not, it doesn't really matter, but as you get older and you get more aware of sexuality, the movie takes on very different tones that you can, I think, appreciate more as a more mature person than if you're just 18 and watching it with a group of friends. And, at that age, it's just, people get ripped apart by hooks.
Yeah.
But, watch it in your 30s and all of a sudden, oh, okay, so this is a really dysfunctional, sexually explicit and bizarre relationship, and that's a different kind of horror at that point.
And the way, like that horror, that sort of, the sort of obsessional, like that's the horror, and then the Cenobites are almost like what is it? It's not a Deus Ex Machina. It's like the opposite. It's sort of like they're this intercessionary force that comes in, which is very interesting. You don't see, like, it really is almost like Greek, that's another big thing, is sort of Greek plays. I love those. But they're this intercessionary thing that tells you something about the world this is in, as much as anything.
They are like gods coming down from Mount Olympus, interfering with things because it's getting to their attention. Gods in Greek myth and Norse myth. It's very interesting how many commonalities Norse and Greek myths have, considering the distance between them, and relative lack of contact in their formative centuries. But the idea that gods only start intervening in mortal affairs when mortals start basically drawing their attention, and the Cenobites are very much the same. That movie would work as a perfectly normal giallo-esque exploitative sexual horror film if it was just Uncle Frank wearing, asking for souls and skin and all of that, and that he wants to kill his niece or have sex with her or whatever it is he's trying to do by the end. The Cenobites are... I love the fact that they're there, don't get me wrong, but they are as you say, they're an interceding force. Come the second one, they're of course far more on the main stage. By the third one, they're just slashers at that point. Yeah. And I like a slasher movie, but it's just such a waste.
The first movie is so special because they only show up a few times. Like, that is truly a cool thing about it. That really, like, that's part of what gets me going about it. But like, I'm personally of the opinion that, like, one of the reasons why I love horror, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to horror writers about this is I almost think that in order to have a defense of horror, you have to have a defense of pleasure, like in the sort of hedonistic sense that any desirable mental state is sort of according to the hedonist's pleasure. And you have to, there is no way to defend portraying the monstrous. There's no way to do it unless you say pleasure is worthwhile. And that's very interesting because I think you can sort of defend romance, for example, by saying, look, you want to describe this positive human experience, and you can go, okay, but for horror, and I think maybe only for horror, you have to have a defense of pleasure. So that's what I like about it. Your average slasher movie does it in a very simplistic way. Lots and lots of sex followed by lots and lots of violence. Right. But Hellraiser and Hellraiser 2 are excellent examples of that idea, that hypothesis, because the lead antagonists in both, Frank in the first one and Dr. Channard in the second one, want to experience what the Cenobites have to offer. Despite the fact we know that it's going to be utterly terrible, and they probably know as well, except there's always an element of surprise, but there's an embedded expectation that these characters are S&M addicts, possibly more masochistic than sadistic. And what's most interesting about that from an antagonist point of view is, one, we rarely see antagonists who are portrayed as masochists, and two, they are they're dooming themselves, and they're doing so with a sense of relish. They are looking forward to their demise. Yeah, and that's very much mirrored in the sort of seductress woman. She's going toward this abusive, very abusive man because she's got this call of the void. Like the whole movie's about that.
Yeah, Julia's l'appel du vide.
Yes. So yeah, I fucking love Hellraiser, man.
Yeah, it's good fun. It is good fun. It's the fact that it presents such violent masochism as pretty much normal is, I think, the underrated part of what makes that movie great. It's not a mindset I can empathise with as a viewer, but it's one I can appreciate as a viewer, that it's an incredibly bold move to take a kink, a defining kink, and say, yeah, that's this character. We're not doing it for titillation. We're not doing it to give a wry eyebrow raise or sound effect. It's not there to make you laugh or to make you judge this person as being lesser because they are submissive or whatever the case may be. It is that's them, and this is where that path will take them in this horrific version of reality. It's a really bold vision, I think, that I'm glad Clive Barker got to put onto celluloid.
So this is not telling you anything about me sexually. I have the strongest call of the void that I know anybody had. Like, I look at something, I'm like, that is a terrible idea, and I want to see how this is going to play out. So, question. You worked on the 5th edition of Vampire the Masquerade and updated some of the clan descriptions, right?
Yeah, all of them up until the companion.
Right. So, there were a few of them, the Assamites became the Banu Hakim and got a different Bane, because the old one was, they got darker as they... I don't know if my audience is going to know Diablo is.
No. Yeah. Well, okay, so...
that was the old one.
That the Banu Hakim, or Assamites, as they used to be called, which is an incredibly sort of anglicised word for children of Assam. No one who is actually from Syria, or I believe Alamut is supposed to be in Syria, which is the clan's ancestral home, although it may well have moved around from book to book, is going to call themselves an Assamite. They're not speaking that language. Banu Hakim makes a lot more sense. But so that was an easy change. The Banu Hakim, over the editions of Vampire the Masquerade running up to 5th edition, had a series of something like 3 different curses. It may have even been more, as it changed from edition to edition. And sometimes, I think at first, their very first clan bane curse, call it what you like, was they get darker and darker skinned with age, until they are sort of obsidian black creatures that are, demons of the night. And yes, I admit that from a visually striking standpoint, there is something to that. But there's a problem to it as well. One, it's the clan that is based on sort of Middle Eastern myth that is turning increasingly black. We don't have another clan that's changing a colour more and more as they get old. And there was also the issue that in live-action roleplays you would have white people wearing blackface to portray an elder Assamite or Banu Hakim.
Yeah.
There were a lot of issues embedded with it. And I remember when I was working on V5, one of the writers, who I won't name, was really keen on bringing this back because it had been dropped off in some editions and come back in sidebars and little notes and things, but it had largely been got rid of, and they were really keen on bringing this back and were sort of petitioning for it. And I said, rather incredulously, facetiously, well, yeah, sure, let's make the Ventru clan turn increasingly green with age because they love money. And he said, well, that would be stupid. And I said, I think turning the Banu Hakim increasingly black with age is stupid as well. I think we've moved on from that at this point. And the thing is, I know that curse, that bane, was first written by a black author, an author of colour. And so I don't believe it was built from a position of racism or anything like that. I just think that it's funny, actually, because I'm kind of going to contradict myself based on what I said earlier. It is a rule that can actually encourage inappropriate play. So where we were talking earlier about, can you write a system to encourage, I guess, good play, then this was the opposite, I would say. As time went on, as we became more worldly, as we became more aware of the number of idiots that exist in the world, and can weaponize this for racist purposes, the fact is, nothing of value was lost to remove it. There was no one who was going to say, well, I'm not going to play a Banu Hakim anymore if they don't turn increasingly black with age, because it didn't define them. It was a feature that was horribly dated and poorly thought out and should have been put to the stake many, many years ago. So changing that, for me, wasn't a huge hardship.
Yeah, how do you... So, there's also, the Malkavians who can be... I have mixed feelings about the Malkavians. I am mentally ill, but at the same time, it's
I have mixed feelings about the Malkavians as well. I have said on many occasions, well, not many, I've said on a few occasions, if there was a clan I could get rid of. Usually it's people will ask me if there's a clan you could just purge from vampire entirely, which one would it be? And I often say Malkavian, because of the way they have, it's not generally how they are written. And I'm not saying this just to cover the asses of my fellow writers, most of whom I've never met, who worked on previous editions. But certainly the way a lot of them were portrayed is, haha, I'm goofy because I'm mad.
Yeah, like the vampire, the
fish mouth. Mm-hmm. And it's really... It's troubling because you also get players who say, well, my Malkavian's going to be the Joker. Almost everyone, well, not almost everyone, so many vampire players who want to play Malkavian say, I want to play Heath Ledger's Joker, basically. I want to be chaos, I'm unbridled, I can do things, and it's going to set wheels in motion and just piss people off. And so that's another end of the spectrum. They are trying to play someone who has a mental illness without making it wacky, but it's still disruptive, and it isn't an actual mental illness. It's just someone who is
crazy.
Well, not even. Yeah, exactly. It's loosely defined as a crazed psychopath.
Yeah.
And then, amidst all of that, you have the very real question of, well, let's say we want to portray them as being really mentally ill, that when you get cursed by Malkavian, you gain depression or anxiety, or you're bipolar, or you're schizoid or schizophrenic, or have anything, any derangement, as they used to be called. And then there's a lot of onus on the players, on the groups, on the storytellers. Yeah, you are trying, and it can be a fantastic challenge. You can learn a lot about yourself through doing it. You can do it sensitively, not diminishing that whatsoever. But then you have an incredibly popular Vampire the Masquerade video game released in the early 2000s where the Malkavian has a conversation with a stop sign, and that gets applauded far more than the sensitive treatment of depression in this passage in a book. More people are going to look to that as a reference of how do I play my Cat in the Hat Malkavian than this is how to accurately portray someone who's suffering from a schizoid personality. So I have arbitrarily or rashly at times said I'd get rid of them entirely, because I don't feel there is a sensitive way, an intelligent way to salvage a clan that's curses we're mentally ill. But, and this is the big but, the big caveat, is the number of people that will come to me whenever I say this and say, I am mentally ill, I have a mental illness, and playing a Malkavian genuinely helps me, or reading about Malkavians genuinely helps me, or I don't mind other people playing Malkavians like that because I feel like there is a clan for me. For one thing, it speaks to the strength of the clan divisions in Vampire the Masquerade, that players feel so strongly that they can identify with the clans. It's a great part of Vampire, to a lesser extent Werewolf and Mage and the other World of Darkness games, that people will look at these classes in D&D sense, but where most people won't look at D&D and say, in real life I'm a ranger. In Vampire, they will look at Vampire the Masquerade and say, in real life, I'm a Gangrel, or in real life, I'm a Brujah, or Malkavian. And who am I to take that away from people? Who am I to say, no, you can't play a Malkavian anymore because you'll do it wrong? So no, in my games, maybe, I wouldn't include Malkavians, but then, if someone wants to play a Malkavian, if I don't think they're going to be disruptive, I'm not going to outlaw it. And I think this is a good rule for gaming, for life in general. Again, that sort of absolute measure, that hard no, is rarely conducive to a good communal experience. Setting barriers is far less useful and enjoyable and friendly and collaborative than asking a question, okay, so what do you have in mind for your Malkavian? And then trying to be constructive about how to play a Malkavian in an interesting way that isn't going to offend everyone. So it's, you could probably look at the vast majority of the clans in Vampire the Masquerade and find something problematic about each and every one of them, I'm sure, and I don't say that flippantly. The idea of people having a specific blood type because they, it's, in theory, the easiest weakness or curse, bane to deal with, and to put right on the page. My vampire will only feed on people with blue eyes. Now find someone who will take that to an unusual and unpleasant extreme. What does that say about the victims? And what does it say about the vampire, that they will only feed on someone with blue eyes? And I'm being sort of reductio absurdum about it, because some people are, and ultimately the conversation needs to happen between the storyteller and the players in all of these cases, and that's why having these disclaimers at the beginning of a game is really smart. They can be a short conversation. Just find out what people want to do, the story they want to tell, the characters they want to play. If there's anything problematic at the beginning, nip it in the bud, or ideally be constructive about how to make it less problematic.
I'm going to ask you something you get asked all the time. Do you have a clan that you identify with at this time?
Not anymore.
Okay.
Not anymore, no. There was a time when I would have looked at the Cappadocians, or Hecata, I guess, as they are now, or even the Giovanni, and said, that speaks to me. I liked the idea of powers behind a throne, independent advisor types, mercenary types, people who didn't necessarily hold affiliation to the hierarchy but would manipulate it from afar. People with an art that not many people understood. That spoke to me. But as well as the doomed aspect of Cappadocians, the fact that they, I think a lot of people are drawn to them and the Salubri purely because of their rarity, and I don't say that in a disparaging way. I think it makes for a natural appeal. If there are fewer of something, they are more interesting than generic option A.
Honestly, everybody should be playing a protagonist. This is an RPG. Why are we telling a story about you if you're not the fucking protagonist, man?
Exactly. I'm sure there are many interesting stories where everyone is just an extra, but most of the time, you want to be a protagonist. But these days, I don't know whether it's a combination of burnout for Vampire, or probably more likely that now that I've worked on it for so long, I think I first wrote for Vampire the Masquerade in 2016, maybe even in 2015, and I've been pretty consistently doing so since, across various editions, board games, video games, all kinds, because I do have a lot of vampire knowledge in my head. I'm useful in these jobs, and hopefully good at them. I imagine I am, because I keep getting hired. But when you see how the sausage is made enough times, you eventually stop wanting sausage. And that's not to say I dislike vampire at all, but I certainly don't see it through the same eyes as... I don't look at it as a fan anymore. I don't look at it as a game I'm desperate to play. I will run it, but even then there are things I would prefer to run. Vampire is my bread and butter. It's my staple. It's a staple in my diet. But it isn't something that I will get excited about so much anymore, which may be a bit tragic, because I was maybe the biggest vampire fan there was before I started working on it. But, you work with something, you work with a hobby, there's a very real risk that you lose love for that hobby. I'm not, thankfully. I love role-playing, I love board games, I love gaming in general, but vampire it isn't what it was for me anymore, which might make some people sad, but I'm perfectly fine with it. I've come to love other things in this hobby more maybe than I loved vampire. So
it's good.
Preferences change.
It's good that you get to be an evolving person. I think.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, it'd be very easy to get caught in a trap of just doing the same thing over and over again, and I will never turn vampire work down, because I am good at it. I can do it fast, I can do it, I know the tone of the game, I can just belt out vampire. But at the same time, if, not that this would ever happen, if I was in a lineup of 5 writers and the other 4 of them were brand new, and they were champing at the bit to work on Vampire the Masquerade for the first time and they loved it, I would be getting out of that line, because they want it. I can do it. I want the money, but I've said most of what I have to say for Vampire the Masquerade, at least off the top of my head. These days, I'd be better off being directed on Vampire than developing Vampire. That may change in the future, but we will see, I suppose.
So, I guess this is a natural place to start talking about your more recent projects. Let's see.
Uh-oh.
Let's see. So...
The upcoming revolution.
So I actually heard of They Came From Beneath the Sea before I heard about you, because I watch MST3K.
Good. I'm glad you saw the ad.
Did. And so I think I didn't own it yet, but once I made the connection, wait, this is the same guy, I went and bought it. So you pitched that, you created that, and it's just for people who don't know, it's sort of, you play a sort of 1950s, 1960s B-movie. You role play that. Could you talk about how that evolved? Because it didn't start out as a B-movie, right? Concept.
No, not at all. It was a confluence of a lot of ideas, really, and I think my story changes slightly each time I tell it, but I'll try and be somewhat consistent. So, for one thing, I've been a massive cinephile ever since my teens. I will watch a lot of genres. I'll watch much of anything if there is any merit to it, and often even if there isn't. And I have a deep abiding love of science fiction and horror, but by no means am I limited to both of those genres. Now, I will also do so through a critical lens. I love talking about movies, and TV in real agonizing depth that few people can tolerate. So I was thinking about a new game I wanted to run, wanted to design. This was before I was a writer, really, called They Came From Beneath the Sea. I already had the name in mind. And the game came from a video game I'd been playing really a lot of. I'd been revisiting it for a Let's Play on my YouTube channel. Back when that was a big active concern, and that game was called XCOM Terror from the Deep, which was the second in the UFO Enemy Unknown series from way back in the 90s before they got rebooted. And in this game, you played a squad of aquanauts that went down to the seabed. There were aliens rising up, very Lovecraftian in nature, attacking yachts and coastal resorts and things like that. You had to go down, ultimately find their base and kill them. I loved the idea. I loved the squad idea. I loved giving these characters names, a bit of personality, seeing them die horribly. I thought this could make for a passable role-playing game. Your special ops against aquatic aliens. Why the hell not? And so I bolted onto it a very rudimentary system and ran a couple of sessions of it at a games convention, UK Games Expo, many, many years ago, and it was terrible. Utterly dry, flavourless, dire game. And so I thought, well, that's that then. And around this time, I was also running a game called All Flesh Must Be Eaten. It's a zombie role-playing game by Eden Studios. I think it's still in print, maybe. And this game is fairly serious. It's a fairly serious zombie apocalypse game. But at Halloween, for my gaming club, I would run a special. And on this year, I ran a special All Flesh Must Be Dark Place, which was a mix-up of a series called Garth Marenghi's Dark Place, which is about a haunted hospital. It's very silly, very funny, and based on 80s style, 70s, 80s style live drama.
I've seen a little bit of it, so yeah.
And horror. It's very, very good. And I mixed this up so that the Dark Place Hospital was being attacked by zombies. This is a long story, unfortunately. And I gave everyone characters, and rather than them just being standard All Flesh Must Be Eaten characters, these were characters from the TV show, and if you could recite quotes that were on the sheets from the TV show, then you would get bonus dice or something like that. Now, I did that. That's where the quip from They came from, and also where the idea of having a character spout one-liners for bonuses, and it also was where the sort of dark place, shoddy sets, bad acting element came from. Now, I also ran a superhero game around this time. It was, months between all of these. And it was 1960s Batman-esque, so I had printed out all the pows and zaps and kapows and biffs, so that when you hit someone, if you played one of these cards, these bright, vivid Technicolor POWs, you would get bonuses. All of this came together ultimately to form what They Came From Beneath the Sea became, which was a very vivid 1950s, 60s B-movie game where you could play quip cards so your character would utter an entertaining but maybe inappropriate one-liner at a certain point. Cinematic powers, like a cheap set, you could run through a wall if you were cornered by an alien, or you could just insert a deleted scene or the like to justify why you had a rocket launcher all of a sudden. Started playing around with the idea of there being a sort of meta-currency, a meta-narrative, that you as players are ultimately forming a film, and the characters in it are the characters in the film, but you can just change things around them. And so this just developed until I could pitch it to Onyx Path Publishing, who Richard Thomas loved the idea, suggested some tweaks. We made them. We adopted a system that Onyx Path were already using because it fit pretty much perfectly, the story path system. And from there, we made the game, and it has done pretty well. We're very happy with it, to the point that we've released several versions now that deal with different movie genres, cinematic genres, I should say. So They Came From Beyond the Grave is Hammer 1960s, 70s horror, Technicolor blood, a bit sexy. They came from Camp Murder Lake, which is an expansion to Beyond the Grave, as the name implies. It's 1980s slasher movies predominantly, but not only. And in development right now, we've got They Came From Classified, which is espionage features and media, and They Came From the Cyclops' Cave, which is everything from sort of Odysseus and Iliad stuff all the way through to Sword and Sorcery, Conan, Krull, Hawk the Slayer, up to Hercules and Xena in the mid-90s. Because all of these genres, especially when we're looking at them, have something a bit cheap, something a bit funny, a bit worthy of our not only mockery but affection. And that's what's key. They are tributes. They honour the genres. They take a lot of inspiration from them. We're not just saying, ha ha, aren't these movies rubbish? We're saying, if you like Plan 9 from Outer Space, or if you think it's funny, you can play it with this game, pretty much as it appears on screen, maybe even make it worse. If you like Manos, The Hands of Fate, you can do it with Beyond the Grave, and probably make it considerably better than Manos, The Hands of Fate, because it's a dreadful, dreadful movie that is only entertaining because it's on MST3K. And you can do it all the way through to actually decent films. I've ran a lot of Beyond the Grave games, They Came From Beyond the Grave, that are very similar to The Wicker Man or Blood on Satan's Claw, the kind of things where, oh dear, our car's broken down in a remote village where everyone's treating us very peculiarly, because it's a fantastic setup for a horror story. We're trapped here, everyone's weird, they want to sacrifice us in some way, how are we going to survive the night? And when you accept the conceit that this is within a movie, that it's within a frame, and you can start using movie-like structures to affect what's going on at the table, then I think you can have a lot of fun with it.
I'm glad you, yeah.
That's the idea.
I'm glad you mentioned, the fact that this was affectionate, because I did get that. I was talking to Bill Corbett the other day, and one of the things I said about him is it just doesn't work. I appreciate about him that they took some joy in it, because it just doesn't work as a funny thing if the message is this sucks. And I really appreciate that about MST3K, and I did appreciate that about this book as well. I've only read the one They Came From Beneath the Sea, but I was really taken. Do you know who Berthold Brecht is?
Yes.
It's Brechtian. It's very Brechtian. It's incredible. I was getting really excited because it's like this. There are all these. The core mechanics are taking our means to sort of distance the players from the. There's that Brechtian. Sorry, viewers and listeners, if you think this is pretentious, but sadly, we've all been classically trained on this interview. There's the brilliance of a Brechtian play is when they start moving the scenery around the players, and when they break the fourth wall and address the audience, when they take what Shakespeare does in Richard III and make that an entire saga rather than a feature of a single play. Where a lot of people will look at a play like Richard III and say, well, and they will fall in love with it because of the breaking the fourth wall, the constant addressing the audience, you are part of my conspiracy, ha ha ha. And Brecht basically does that on, sort of writ large. The entire audience is part of the production, essentially. And it means, there's some remove. You could argue, on one level, it's not as immersive as another play, but on another, because you've removed that barrier between the audience and the performance, you could argue
that it's even more immersive than before. It depends on how your brain is
Speaking
wired.
of like how like encouraging play, I think I've heard you say, because I deliver groceries, I always have somebody talking. I've listened to a lot of your videos. I apologize. I think I've heard you say.
Thank you very much.
I think I've heard you say that you prefer a style of play where people are a little bit more removed, as opposed to like very.
Yeah.
So you definitely do. It's very interesting to me that you made a game that sort of it builds into the mechanics. Take a little distance from this.
Yeah, there's a workman-like attitude, I suppose, that I have, which is... This is my Philistine... Oh, come on, it's a game. What do you mean? You're that into it that you're crying. That's only a small part. The fact is, there's also a fear where I have been I have been exposed to a lot of players that take games badly, mostly live-action roleplay, and it's part of the reason I'm not a big fan of live-action roleplay personally. I know a lot of people love it, and all power to them. I'm not a big fan, and part of the reason for that is because I don't enjoy seeing people experience what's called bleed, where they immerse themselves in character, where they need to wind down after the game, where they need to sort of shake this character off of them. It may sound selfish. It ruins the fun for me, because I never experienced that, or it has been a very rare instance where I have. That's not me being snobbish. I don't think less of them. It's just the medium. Yeah, the medium does not appeal to me. And so there's games, of course, people will play at the tabletop, which will do the same thing. And sometimes I love to make a player gasp in shock. I have made a couple of players cry, thankfully, by their consent. I have made people feel disturbed and need to walk home together because they were scared of what was presented. All of that is fine by me, but at the same time, I do feel the idea of deep immersion, where one identifies so closely with the character that sort of every hit they're taking is a hit to the player, is something I really struggle with as a storyteller. It is something I don't want to engage with particularly. Again, not because I'm judgmental, but because it's outside of my comfort zone. And so by creating a game where there is a barrier of sorts between... this isn't actually real, this is just a game. You're just playing to have fun. For me, there's a certain purity to that, because I appreciate games that are just trying to bring joy. I think there's still immersion to that. I think the fact that joy it's an underrated emotion,
yes,
quite frankly. It's very easy to, in my view, some of the easiest emotions to evoke are horror, shock, as surprise, very easy to get out of someone. You can get frustration or sorrow. Next would be on the list. Genuine anger and genuine joy are things that I think are like at peak emotion that I may want to reach. I don't really want to make people angry, of course, for what their character is going through, but I do want people to feel genuine happiness because of what they're experiencing at the table. And to have people laughing consistently through a game, to have people walk away from the gaming table afterwards with big smiles on their face, telling stories about what just happened at the table, that is what I want to aim for. And I find that it's quite difficult to do that in the sort of deeply melodramatic, overwrought style, deep immersive gaming that comes with a lot of live action roleplay and some other tabletop games, which I also enjoy writing for, like Vampire. they came from makes no illusions. It's not trying to make you break your hearts over your character's fate. It's trying to make you laugh about your character's just been eaten by a giant octopus.
I'm excited to find people to play it with, definitely. So I'm gonna try. Yeah.
I hope you do.
Let's see. So before this interview a few days ago, I made a mistake and I listened to one of your actual plays of I think
okay.
What do you call it? I think it was The Family. I think I started listening to that.
Oh yes.
You are so fucking good. Like, I'm sorry. Like you are like of course you have a beautiful speaking voice, but that's not what I'm talking about. You have such a good voice of just you know when to like, you know when to pause, you know when to like that sort of thing. Like there's a very musical quality to like written voice, and you really have that on the fly, which is fucking unreal. But so I promise.
Oh, see, for me, it feels very deliberate. I feel like I have a very deliberative way of conveying my stories and the way I speak. I tend to think a word ahead of what I'm saying at the very least. So there is definitely a plan. I do really appreciate it. I'm very gratified that you think that I run a game so well. I don't, I obviously couldn't do it without the players. Everything I do in games, and I may be selling myself short, I don't know, but I feel like everything I do is reactive. I'm a very good improviser when it comes to situations that are set up for me. Now, that makes me somewhat odd, I think, as a GM, because there'll be a lot of GMs who quite comfortably lead their players around by the nose, and a lot of players enjoy that too. They want to go from point A to point B to point C and achieve a mission by the end of it. Mission-based games. It was one of my first exposures to role-playing, and I really struggled with them because I didn't enjoy them at all. But as a GM, I found that, okay, well, if I put all these characters in a room and they've got all of these conflicting agendas, and there is someone antagonistic and there's someone supportive, there's someone familiar and there's someone unknown, and we already know what characters these players are playing, so let's see how they bounce off of them. I think that I'm very adept at making those supporting characters interesting and colouring the world through those supporting characters. It means that most of my games have a lot of dialogue in rather than fighting scenes. I'm really bad. I consider myself really bad at running fight scenes because I'm not as comfortable describing sort of existential threat as I am describing internal anguish or vocalizing it through someone's dialogue. So it's interesting to be praised. I do appreciate that, and I'm not being flip when I say that. It's one of those things where I could spend the time analysing my own GMing, really thinking what works and what doesn't. And part of me doesn't want to, because not that I don't want your questions. I'm more than happy to have your questions. I mean, I'm never going to sit there and think to myself, this is what I want to do more of in a game, and maybe more reflection would be healthy for me. I certainly examine it when I get things wrong. The one thing I rarely do, and I should be kinder to myself, is examine when I get things right. I don't think, and I don't think many people do, think, that was really good. I did a really good job there. Pat myself on the back. I just don't. I just move on. But if I get something wrong, I'll of course agonise over it and think, well, shit, what can I do to stop that from happening again?
I'm really interested in live plays because, like, I first got into it via Dimension 20, and their strength is pacing, which is nuts, absolutely nuts, that they can just, they know exactly when to cut a scene. They're very good at that. I think Jason Carl, who, of course, you know, he's very good at sensual details. Like, he's very good at all of that. And you've just got this voice, which is, like, a lot of people don't, like, there are people like Barry Weiss, who's like a writer, who there's going to be a funeral and she's never going to have a line anybody can quote. Like, she's not a fucking writer. And so I have this, but you have lines, man. Like, it's so fucking good. So yeah.
Well, Jason and I are probably polar opposites in our style, and I don't say this in any way dismissively because I think they both have merit. I think Jason very much lets the players take the stage. I am a constant presence on the stage, and you know, it's partly symptomatic of the medium through which Jason is running games. You know, he's doing so with things like LA by Night as pretty much a panel show. And so, you know, the visually everyone is present. I actually prefer audio roleplay to visual, if I'm doing it online anyway. I have a Patreon with something like 6 games running on it right now. Yeah, 6 games I run a month, 6 individual groups, and as well as my weekly local group and other things I might run to promote games. So I'm running a lot of games at once, but all my Patreon ones are all audio only. I don't do anything over video. I find it too distracting, and it's I don't think, especially for horror, I don't think it's as conducive for tension or any kind of build of suspense if you can just see each other constantly. Now, it's different around a table. If I'm in person, I think it's better ultimately, the best kind of roleplay is everyone in a room. But, yeah, to do it online, I prefer just to be voices like myself.
When I ran my game, we were giggling constantly, which was, it just didn't turn out to be a horror game, which was great. We had a wonderful time, but it's not a horror game at that point. And I think it's easier not to, like, giggle if you can't see each other, I imagine.
Well, I think it's fantastic that you're giggling. I'm not mocking
it's just like
that
the mood you want to
because well, again, that's something where I think I depart a great deal. The Red Moon role-playing actual plays like The Family, the various cult games I've ran for them, which I recommend if people like my horror. I think my best horror stories are the cult stories I ran for Red Moon role-playing. I think they are anomalies when compared to how I usually run games. They are produced in the sense that Red Moon Role-Playing do edit them a little. They edit out the mechanical side more than anything else. We're pretty pitch perfect at this point in terms of how we role-play with each other because we've been doing it for quite a long time. But my comfort level is definitely laughing at the table, even when playing horror games. I just, again, have little patience for running a Vampire the Masquerade game where everyone has to be grim and serious all the time. I need humour. I'm running Wraith the Oblivion for one of my Patreon groups, and yes, it has horror, yes, it has personal horror. It is about having died and the regrets you leave behind, so it's natural, it's inbuilt. A lot of people consider Wraith the most depressing role-playing game ever made, and I say that's absolute nonsense. It depends on the attitude you bring, and for one thing, Richard Dansky, one of the original developers of Wraith, says it's the most hopeful World of Darkness game. But I feel my group, as an example, is laughing all the time. That they are encountering absurd concepts now that they are dead. They are encountering people who, if they met them while they were living, they would laugh at. So why won't they laugh at them now just because they're dead? Yeah, there's a sense of ennui and uncertainty, and there's a shadow gnawing them away from the insides, but there are still other people to speak to, there's still structures to observe, hierarchies to get involved in, threats to overcome, and it is a natural human behaviour to laugh at adversity. So players should, in my view, always feel comfortable laughing when they're gaming. I think it's healthy to do so myself.
So, here's my last written question. As you move into developing your own games, even understanding that you sell the concepts, even understanding that they're collaborative, what is a Matthew Dawkins game? Like, what does it look like? What are the themes? Like, that sort of thing.
What is a Matthew Dawkins game? It's changed over time, I would say. I would say now a Matthew Dawkins game would probably be close to where they came from game. It's a game that is blatantly attempting to be entertaining without prescribing humour. It isn't telling you this is funny and this is not. It's not saying make a joke here to make other people laugh. It's nothing like that. It is providing you with the tools to make for an entertaining experience, whether your form of entertainment is horror, humour, drama, romance, conspiracy, whatever the case may be. My games are built with fun in mind. And sometimes that means really simplistic systems, sometimes it means slightly clunky systems that allow you to achieve those ends. But for my money, if, as I mentioned earlier, if people walk away from one of my games smiling, having played it, then that's mission accomplished as far as I'm concerned. I don't need any more than that. I don't need prizes or awards from the Ennies or any of these other things. It's yeah, well, you know. But crucially, I didn't put my games forward for that. I have won Ennies. That's the leading award, I guess, in the RPG industry. But you have to submit your products for those awards. And you have to submit all of the panelists on the Ennies with a physical copy of your game. It's one of those things that most of the customers and fans aren't aware of. So that puts an automatic restriction on those who don't necessarily want to put the money toward doing that. And it also creates a very small pool of contestants. Now, that's not to say that they are unearned. Almost every Ennie award winner I've ever seen has earned it. But there's an awful lot of games that just don't enter the running because the creators either didn't submit them themselves or couldn't afford to. And this isn't me, I'm not about to lead my own Marxist revolution when it comes to the Ennies and so, votes for everyone. Well, I would if I thought they had any capitalistic merit. I don't know of many people who have purchased a game because it won an Ennie. I think they are great for making people in the industry feel good about their work, that they've been critically appraised. I think that's good. We should tell each other when our work is good, just as our audience should tell us when they enjoy our work. But I don't strive for it. I'm happy just seeing smiling faces because I'm a simple person. With who just wants everyone to be happy in the world.
It's wonderful.
Especially people that pay me money.
Well, unless you have... what do you have to plug right now?
Well, I mean, if people manage to stick around with
and
us
I'll put
for
everything
this
down
long...
in the description as well, so...
If this is going up soon... I recommend people look up a game called Trinity Continuum Aether. Aether is spelled Aether. It is a game set in 1895. It's heavily uses a lot of public domain characters. So it has Dracula, Sherlock Holmes, it has Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it has Moriarty, Mina Harker, most of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and it also has Martians invading from War of the Worlds. It's a game where the Aether is a fifth element of sorts, liquid lightning you can use to modify your body, space around you. There's a bit of steampunk to it, a bit of dystopia in the fact that the Martians are invading. There's a bit of wonder and superheroism because, of course, you can give yourself abilities with this new science. It's, as I hope to strive for with everything, a lot of fun. And it's currently on Kickstarter. We've already passed 200% of our funding target, so don't stress yourself. But if you are interested in a game like that, and it's so well illustrated, I mean, I often harp on about the quality of writing in the books I work on, but the artists require a lot of credit on this. They deserve it, because Aether is looking absolutely stunning. A beautiful book. I recommend checking it out on Kickstarter while it's still on there and giving us your backing. For just $5, you can access the entire manuscript and read what this book contains. And then if you don't like it, just cancel your pledge. If you do like it, up your pledge for an actual copy of the book, PDF or traditionally printed. And I will love you forever for doing so. Otherwise, check out MatthewDawkins.com. Has my full list of credits, which are extensive, and if you click on any of them, they're all hyperlinks. I think should be able to get some discounts through some of those links to buy books I've worked on. So if something appeals, give it a shot. Final thing. Thank you very much. Final thing is, as I mentioned, I do have a Patreon. Most freelancers do, or a Coffee or similar. And mine is a Patreon. Most people who back my Patreon do so to play in games I run. Currently, I am running, as I mentioned, 6 games for various Patreon groups. So I've got a lot of people signed up. But more are always welcome. I can always make more room for more games if people are paying for the pleasure of playing with me. Do sign on. That's patreon.com/Matthew Dawkins.
Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you very much for having me and for such a long interview, 1 hour longer than anticipated. You don't need to say sorry. I was the one who kept saying it's fine, and it is. It's very rare that I get to expound on the evils of communism. It's rare that I get to expound on one of my favourite subjects, which is Soviet history and politics in general, but especially the politics of the left, of which I consider myself a member.
Comrade.
I think a comrade. Exactly. I will go and adorn my fur cap and long trench coat so I can pretend that I am a 1940s Russian, and go and march on Red Square.